Welcome to the American Shoulder and Elbow Surgeons Podcast. I'm your co-host, Brian Waterman, a sports and shoulder elbow surgeon at Wake Forest. I'm fortunate to have Peter Chalmers, a shoulder and elbow surgeon at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City, as my co-host. Peter, how are you doing this evening?
Oh, I'm doing great. I'm really excited to do this episode with you.
Absolutely. We're on fire for this one. Before we get started, I should mention that the views expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the views of the American Shoulder Elbow Surgeons, the University of Utah, Wake Forest University, or any of the institutions of our guests. With that disclaimer out of the way, it really is our distinct privilege today to usher in somewhat of an outside of the box topic for the discussion. And it's something that's wholly relevant and practical for pretty much the entirety of our audience. And it's really that of prior authorizations. Before we start to groan or whisper obscenities under your breath, I want to first introduce our guests and bring in some of our colleagues that are really leading on the advocacy front. First, I'd like to welcome Dr. Adam Bruggeman, an orthopedic spine surgeon at the Texas Spine Center in San Antonio, Texas. Among his many roles and responsibilities, he's the current chair of the AOS Advocacy Council and adjunct faculty at University of Texas for Health Sciences. He has long served as a vocal leader on the Capitol Hill and across the healthcare landscape. Adam, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Next up is Brad Bushnell, who joins us from the Harbin Clinic in Rome, Georgia, where he serves as chair of orthopedics, team physician for the Rome Braves and Berry College. He has a longstanding interest in healthcare finance and policy. Brad, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Brian. It's good to be here.
So let's launch in. As we kind of set the stage for our discussion, perhaps I can have each one of you start with a more general question about what got you interested in the field of healthcare policy. Brad, can we start with you first?
Absolutely. I was actually a religion major in college and didn't have a whole lot of experience with economics, finance, policy, government, other than maybe student government. But when I got through with orthopedic training, residency, fellowship, et cetera, after a few years in private practice at a big clinic, I realized I didn't know a whole lot about the things that really mattered, which were how to run a business and then the external factors that influenced the running of that business. And so I went and got an MBA at the physicians program at Auburn University. And through that, really kind of fell in love with policy and advocacy. At the same time, I was starting to climb the ranks within our state orthopedic society. And we got to see a lot of wins. And I don't think anything gets you hooked on policy work and advocacy work more than seeing a win and how it affects everybody, not just your own practice and your own patients, but at the state level, at least, it affected everybody across the state when we were able to block bad legislation or achieve good legislation. So from there, was able to get more involved at the national level with ASES. But it's very much kind of an organic development of seeing coming out as a neophyte and then seeing the things that they don't teach you a lot about in school and how much those things really matter, and then being able to see your work pay off through those efforts.
That's great. Adam, can you tell us a little bit about how your interest in this field evolved over time?
Yeah, well, I had a little more formal relationship with health policy. I actually did my undergraduate in health policy and health administration. I turned down a medical school acceptance to get my master's, and I went and got my master's in hospital administration. And I worked for HCA Healthcare in South Texas, and worked as a hospital administrator and stayed engaged in policy. Then I went to med school and I came back and was elected as president of the Texas Orthopedic Association at a time where a lot of things were going on. We were passing our Gold Card Act, which I'm sure we'll touch on tonight, about prior authorization. And we also were passing our out-of-network billing which we have a name for, but nationally would be the equivalent of the No Surprises Act. And, the mix of all of that kind of thrust me onto more of a national stage with the academy, having discussions about what we did in Texas and how could that be replicated at a federal level, and grew into the role I'm in now, where I chair the Council on Advocacy, which, for those that don't know, in the academy, we're broken into 4 councils that oversee all the committees report up to a council. And so my council, among other things, oversees what we do in Washington, D.C., our lobbying team, our advocacy group, everything we do from a regulatory standpoint, and then also engages from a PAC standpoint. And so being engaged and involved in all of those things has just kind of snowballed over time. I'm very fortunate to be in the position I'm in, but I really love what I do, and I'm excited to continue to push this forward. I think I was taught at a young age that you just absolutely have to be engaged in advocacy, because if we aren't a part of making those decisions, then someone else will make them for us.
Well, that's a perfect segue to our current topic, which is prior authorizations. I mean, this has been around for a long time, since the 1960s, where it was originally called utilization review, and now is more often seen as prior authorization, or kind of a peer-to-peer. And I think that we probably all understand that the ultimate goal here from the payer side is to reduce cost. But there's, I think, other perspectives that are given about maintaining, appropriate care. Maybe you could give us your current perspective, Adam, on this process.
Yeah, I appreciate the way you frame that. I think we all recognize that eliminating prior authorization is probably not possible. We have, if we look at anything we do from a political standpoint, professional standpoint, there has to be checks and balances. And the insurance companies need to have some ability to check people who, frankly, we know some people in our own profession or other professions within medicine that, if left unchecked, would probably do things that are not ideal, or not in the best interest of patients or patient care. And so unless we can identify a way to self-police that, and self-police it effectively, we have to have prior authorization. But the problem is that it's gotten completely out of hand. And what started out as a simple check and balance has turned into, ruling by the insurance companies with really no balance to this process. It's become entirely too overburdensome. It has hurt patients in the process, and insurers have done everything they can to make sure that they are out of harm's way when it comes to litigation related to this, whether we're talking about being able to create malpractice lawsuits against them, or investigate them. And I think the tide is turning, and I think that the public is finally fed up with the process, not just the physicians, and that's really what's making a difference today.
Brad, what would you add to that?
Adam, very well said. I think we've all seen, I still do some knee work in my practice, and we've all seen a patient referred in for an evaluation who's already had an MRI of the giant piece of metal in their knee, which of course is worthless. And you think, how did that get approved? And we've also seen the crazy stories, like I had one just this week, of an insurance company that wanted a patient to have some physical therapy before they could have their rotator cuff fixed, and then they denied their physical therapy. So you kind of have the prior auth department doesn't talk to the other prior auth department, one for the surgery and one for the therapy. So you see, as Adam described, both the need for it, because we don't need to be ordering MRIs on knees, but then how it's gotten out of hand, where there's so much prior auth that literally it becomes a circular argument of, well, you can't have the surgery approved until you do the therapy, but we won't approve the therapy until what? It just becomes this kind of downward spiral. But I think what's interesting, and because this is an ASES podcast, I will say our perspective as experts within a field um, gives us a little bit more of a jaded view as to the utility of good prior authorization. And Brian and Peter, I hope you don't kick me off for saying that there is such a thing as good prior auth. But it's what Adam says. There are those who maybe need some checks and balances on the tests and procedures that they're ordering. But ironically, those of us that are shoulder experts really don't need it, because for the most part, we do it right. We actually did a study that was published in JSCS. Claude Jarrett out of Wilmington, North Carolina, was the leader on this. And a lot of my colleagues on the advocacy committee helped out with it. But what we found was that amongst the ASES members that were involved in this study, there was only a 1.5% overall denial rate. And so the take home point there is that if you know what you're doing, you generally don't need prior authorization. That folks that are experts at something are not, for the most part, ordering unnecessary tests or inappropriate tests and surgeries. And so I think we within a subspecialty come at it from a perspective of extra frustration, because that overall system of prior auth really isn't targeting us per se, because we, for the most part, always get a yes when it's all said and done. And that may, what we found in that study, I think echoed a lot of what was done in the gold card legislation. So maybe that's a good segue back over to Adam to talk about kind of what gold card is and where we may be going with that. We haven't been able to pull that off here in Georgia, but I know that Texas did, and so that's definitely something we need to get into this discussion. So, Adam, you wanna run with that?
Sure. The best way I can describe, and you set that up perfectly, the best way I can describe the gold card is really the corollary is TSA, the pre-check process. When we look at the pre-check process, what was the purpose of pre-check? The purpose was that people would submit information in advance to the TSA, and they would basically.
Adam, I'm gonna cut you off real quick. Just make sure our listeners know you're talking about TSA at the airport, not total shoulder
yes. Thank you. Good point. The whole point was, though, that to make sure that you gave information in advance so that you could get through security faster. Because we no longer wanted to find a needle in a haystack. We wanted to find a needle amongst needles. In other words, if you've already gone through the process and you've proven that you are a safe person to travel with throughout the United States, I don't want to spend a lot of extra security measures on you. I may allow you to do extra things or go through security faster or go through a process faster, because I know that you're unlikely to be a problem for me. However, everybody who hasn't done that is a potential problem. And so, kind of getting to your point, we have to understand and recognize that there are people who are following the rules on a regular basis. And the purposes of these prior authorizations is not to capture those people. It's instead to try and find the problems within the system, people who are consistently doing things that are not consistent with, say, the ASES gold standards that other shoulder and elbow trained surgeons are doing. And so the Gold Card Act essentially said, let's set a standard. Let's set, if you achieve this bar of excellence, which was debated over and over again, we're at 93%. But if you're able to get authorized at least 93% of the time, then you don't have to go through prior authorization for the next 6 months. And then at the end of that 6-month period, when you know that we're not really looking at you, or we being the insurance company is not looking at you, they're going to do another look back and say, when you weren't being looked at, did you behave, and did you do things the way you've always done them, or did you maybe kind of not behave as much? And if you didn't behave as much, then you might lose the gold card for the next 6 months. It's a great program, and it's a great concept. It's difficult to administer and do it correctly so that it's not gamed by the insurance companies. And I will tell you, when we first passed the Gold Card Act, I was fortunate. I received a gold card, but it was single-digit percentages the first time around. And so we actually just passed another cleanup bill recognizing where we kind of maybe didn't do things as well as we should have, or didn't describe the process well enough, to ensure that more physicians who are good actors are being able to utilize this no prior authorization process through the gold card.
Yeah, Adam, that's a great summary, and obviously an innovative lead in to really what my next question is, which is really to dive into the disconnect between what we often hold up as evidence-based practices and then community standards. Too often we find ourselves led by level 1 and level 2 trials that sometimes can be a little inconclusive. And it's really hard for the literature to keep pace with innovations in medical care in your field, in our field. And so we often get these dated clinical and surgical guidelines that inform these prior authorizations. Brad, how do you address the disconnect in your current practice for this issue?
Brian, that's an awesome question. And what I'm going to say is, in my current practice, day in, day out at work, I'm like pretty much everybody else. I'm a victim because it's what you said earlier. We don't have great literature to fight this stuff because all it takes is one old paper saying, therapy helps with this, or you wait 6 weeks for that, or whatever. But one thing we have been very big at the ASES Advocacy Committee um, is producing more modern research specifically targeted at attacking some of this prior authorization stuff. I think most of last year we were able to produce and then release a very big, almost 40 article special issue of the journal about advocacy and health policy. And there were a few papers within that issue that specifically went after prior auth. Some of which, like the one we did with Jarrett, that basically said we have a very high approval rate, that you're spending all this time and all this money to still approve 98.5% of everything we asked for. But then some other ones to the specifics that you mentioned, Brian, about is physical therapy, does it make a difference in people needing rotator cuff surgery, and under what conditions? Should you have to have PT before you have an MRI? Because historically, we framed research questions along more scientific lines, kind of more traditional points of inquiry about things. And what we're trying to do with some of the advocacy research is not frame it the way we would necessarily think clinically or scientifically, but frame it within the realm of the questions that are being asked by the payers. When they say you can't do this surgery until you have X weeks of PT, we say, okay, fair enough. Does that actually play out? Does our literature say that? And so we've tried to approach that through meta-analyses, systematic reviews, or even original research that takes not necessarily a scientific or clinical question, but takes a policy question as the heart of the study. And we've had some success with that. And so I'm really looking forward to more of that coming out. As Jed Kuhn has taken over as the new editor of JSES, he's really taken what Bill Mallon started on getting advocacy into our literature to the next level by, most of you probably noticed by now, but they've just started a health policy subsection of the journal. So every issue of JSES is now going to have something about policy in it. It may not always be on prior auth, but it will be on hopefully whatever the hot topic is at the time. So I'm looking forward to folks that are into this, that share the frustrations that we've discussed tonight, coming up with some of that original research so that we can take those papers and put them in Adam's hands when he's spending all the time up there in Washington, and give him some ammo as he's meeting with policymakers. And I'm really excited about seeing what comes now that we've kind of thrown the door open to that subset, to that realm of research.
Yeah, no, it's a careful balance, and I think one of the third rail ways of getting around this is designing clinical practice guidelines and best practices. And there certainly have been efforts on behalf of the academy, organizations like within the ASES, the Near Circle, or these Delphi consensus statements. Adam, what are your thoughts on this? Because sometimes I feel like these can be actually weaponized against us, and they do make me concerns when inadequate data is seen as no benefit. Maybe if you can take that and run with it on your thoughts as well.
I mean, I couldn't have said anything better than what Brad just said. I have so much respect for what ASES has done as it relates to prior authorization. To be clear, we can't fully control what the insurance companies decide to do. We have some tools at our disposal, which I'll talk about in a minute, but we can't ultimately decide what they put out as their statements for what is medically necessary or reasonable. But we know that every single medically necessary or reasonable decision made by an insurance company is made based on peer-reviewed literature. And to the extent that we actually have some control as the physicians, right? We're the ones who are writing the peer-reviewed literature to, to ask and answer the questions that are being posed as a result of prior authorization. If we don't love the way that a certain procedure is being perceived as far as the step therapies, meaning the things you have to do in a row, like we were just talking about having to have physical therapy before a rotator cuff repair. If we don't like those things, then let's study them and let's show that if it's something that's obvious to all of us, then let's put it in the literature. Because until it's in the literature, the insurance companies will not respond and will not listen. I, in Spine, just met with the person who's in charge of policy for one of the major insurance carriers. And I'll try and be as vague as I can so as not to kind of frustrate people. But there's a new procedure with a new device that's been out for probably a few decades now, but not well studied. And frankly, when it comes down to it, there's not a new code for it. It utilizes other codes, but it ends up with more codes than the way we used to do things. And as a result of that, is more expensive for the insurance company. We had a great conversation. The person's an orthopedic surgeon. They're board certified. They're a member of the academy. We talked a lot about data, and he indicated to me the exact same thing we're talking about here. Hey, listen, I actually think you guys might be right. My problem is you have no data to support it. If you can go out there and publish the data that shows that this procedure is better than what's out there, given that it's more expensive for us, we would be willing to approve it. But if all you can do is say, we just don't think it's at least not as it's no worse. We don't think it's any worse. We're probably not going to cover it given that it's significantly more expensive for us on a grand scale as a company. So I think utilizing our knowledge and our base to say, okay, what am I frustrated with in prior authorization, and what can I study to show what I know and what all of my other colleagues know is true, that this is not a great step theory. This is a terrible decision that's been made by the insurance companies. We just need to fix the literature, and I think it's such a great process. I'm going to leave with there are things that we can do to bring things to a head. And so, what I would say is if there is one insurance company that is behaving poorly and is doing something that nobody else is doing, this is a policy that, all the other major insurers support. Medicare supports it. And let's say, four of the five big insurance companies support it. But the fifth one is just saying, no way, we won't support it. Most state departments of insurance are willing to hear that. It's going to take some time and some effort to go in and do that as an independent practitioner, but you do have the ability to appeal to the State Department of Insurance and say, listen, while insurance companies have the ability to set their own rules, they have to be reasonable, and they can't just decide one day, Blue Cross Blue Shield's no longer going to cover physical therapy anymore. That would not be reasonable. Every other insurance company covers it. There's a plethora of data that supports that it needs to be covered. So in those scenarios, you do have the backstop of potentially going to your Department of Insurance and filing a formal complaint stating that you feel that the policy is unfair, and usually you need a specific case to cite that from. I have this patient, Mr. Smith, who requires this treatment that's being denied. So there are things to think about, but I love, love, love the idea of improving our literature to support the things that we know need to be done.
Wow, I mean, that was amazing. I did not know you could go to a board of insurance. I have several cases that I may do that for because I have patients that I just see being treated so unfairly. There's two questions I have for you guys as follow-ups. One is that the challenge I think we have with the literature is you can find studies to support whatever you would like to find to support. And there are instances where we really do have the best quality evidence and we're still denied. Like I think rotator cuff repair is maybe the best case example where Stefan Moosmeyer did a randomized clinical trial with 15 years follow-up, and it very clearly shows that repair is better than physical therapy. And yet I still have to have that conversation on a weekly basis. The second question I have for you, and this is maybe one that's more pertinent to academic surgeons, but there's probably the place where I find get tripped up the most frequently with insurance is in procedures that are less common. Like capitellar osteochondral allografting is a good one. Sternoclavicular reconstruction is a good one. There's a lot of procedures that certainly each one individually may be uncommon, but they can make up a fair number of cases on a yearly basis. And because the insurance companies use these protocols, those patients fall through the cracks, and none of the protocols really apply to them. Is there any effort on the advocacy side to say that there are certain patients that should be exempted from these kind of like rigid protocols, or is that not something that people think about because it would be gamed?
That's a great question, Peter. I'll take it back up to 30,000 feet for just a second, and just say, I know a lot of folks listen to this podcast, and especially a lot of our younger members, and so I'll encourage them just to piggyback a little bit of what Adam said earlier by saying, we need the research. We can write these papers. Every question, Peter, you just asked is a potential for a paper for a young attending or a fellow or a resident. And I had an attending, Laurie Donners, who was one of my favorites. He was a trauma surgeon, and he would say, if you want to go into research, go into an area that nobody else is studying. Sometimes it's something hard or just something nobody else has thought of. And I'll tell those of you that are listening that are young and looking to make your careers in research, policy research is actually a lot easier. A lot of times you can write these papers over the course of a few months by looking back at retrospective data. You don't have to wait 15 years to produce another Moosmeyer paper. You can just knock it out, especially if you go multi-center and collate data from some of your colleagues. So that's more of just a shout to our young listeners to take up this mantle and run with it. Second point is that at the state level, like Adam said, you can challenge these things. And so, Peter, to bring it back to your question of, how do we challenge this? Getting involved with your state orthopedic society, because while Adam's working really hard in DC to change this at the federal level, you can move a little faster sometimes through your state government, especially if you're seeing within your market, within your state, something that's just ridiculous. Like Adam said, one company decides not to do PT. Your state orthopedic societies, if they're high functioning, can really go after that kind of stuff, can collate data within your members and go to the insurance commissioner and say, hey, this is a problem. And you can get some respect by doing that and get the ball moved. And finally, Peter, to your question about the outliers, those are tough, admittedly, because a lot of times those cases, there is no protocol for what's really going on. For an osteochondral capitellar allograft, what's the baseline comparison for that, or what's the comp, if you will, if you use the term from real estate? What's the comp for that? Is it an elbow scope with loose body removal? Is it an LCL repair? Is it something from a different joint? Is it an oats in the knee? Well, it's really none of those things, right? Clinically, it's a big time outlier. And because it has to be size matched and has to be available, It's super complex and super expensive. But I think to be able to answer that question, it goes back to what I was just talking about. We got to do the research. We got to say, not just, hey, here's the clinical technique for this procedure, but somebody does a paper on why it matters to that patient and why ultimately it's a cost-effective means of addressing that problem. How is it that in the long run, osteochondral allograft of the capitellum prevents this person from having debilitating arthritis down the road? The comparison I'll use is out of the European theater, where there are countries that, based on their registry data, will sometimes within their national health systems require people to have a periacetabular osteotomy at a young age, because they have data that shows it's cheaper to do that than to do a total hip on them 10 years later. Because what that PAO buys is 20 years of walking. And therefore they don't need the total hip, which costs a lot more. And so that kind of data, that kind of research really, I think, would help our kind of zebra hunters, if you will, the folks at the academic centers taking the one-offs, be able to go to the insurance companies and justify them. Is throwing in those things into our research of saying, hey, it isn't just that they have a better ASES score at 5 years. It's cheaper for the system at 5 years. So I'll stop there, and I definitely want to hear Adam's take on Peter's question.
Yeah, that is a tough question. My immediate answer is I have not thought through, nor have I heard anybody else really talk about kind of these special populations that need very specialized surgeries. And I think you're right, probably happens more often at an academic center than in private practice, but happens in both settings. I think it's actually a really great point, something that we'll continue to probably start circulating and socializing with the insurance companies. I would, as an aside note, I would tell you that a decade ago, all advocacy in medicine, not just orthopedics, was focused on fixing Medicare policy, because the thought process was if you fixed Medicare policy, all other policies would follow. I think we know today that Medicare policy, I mean, think about it, just prior authorization standpoint. How many procedures have a prior authorization in Medicare? It's a handful. I think it's 20 or so. But obviously everything we do in health insurance has a prior authorization. And so, we're learning really quickly. We probably weren't watching where the puck was going. And the puck has moved into the private insurance market, and the frustrations that our physicians feel certainly revolve around how much reimbursement looks like from a Medicare standpoint, and how that continues to go down year over year, and how that impacts private insurances. But to a large part, a lot of the burnout, a lot of the things that doctors talk about are private insurance issues. And so we have certainly shifted our focus over the last 2 years that I've been chair of the Advocacy Council, to move towards trying to move the needle with insurance companies, still focusing on federal policy, but beginning an entire process of integrating ourselves with these insurance companies to have conversations on a regular basis and ensure that our concerns and our worries are being brought up through appropriate channels, as opposed to each one of us individually trying to write a letter to our, local branch of Blue Cross Blue Shield and try and getting them to change their perspective, which can be incredibly difficult and usually fruitless. So I'm very proud of the work we're doing there, and you've given me a new idea of something else that we need to add to our next conversation with the major insurance carriers.
Yeah, certainly a topic that is tangential to what Peter is implying is this whole concept of what constitutes a peer. We've talked about the rigidity of protocols, these center mass topics, and maybe how some of the outliers are handled. But when you look at the concept of peer-to-peer review, oftentimes that falls short. There was a recent survey that suggested that only 16% of physicians said that they feel that peers' qualifications were always or often met. So I'm curious how we standardize this and make sure that we're talking to somebody that can do a manual override on some of these somewhat unwieldy policies. Adam, do you want to lead in on that and let us know
Yeah.
where we're going with this on the advocacy front?
I mean, very important topic. Number one, the Gold Card Act in Texas, while it's called the Gold Card Act, if you ask the original sponsor of it, who's a neurosurgeon in Houston by the name of Greg Bonin, he would tell you that the most important part of the Gold Card Act was that it forced all state insurance plans to have a real peer. In fact, in our cleanup bill, for Gold Card, he was so focused on that piece of it and wanted to add in a section that allowed the medical board to have the ability to sanction a doctor who was working in utilization review. And the health plans were going to stop our bill from going through. And so he had to back off. And we removed and stripped that section out of the bill in order to get the Gold Card components of it through. But suffice to say, I think you're spot on with that. I think the other thing to recognize and understand, at least in my experience, is that even though I get on the phone with an orthopedic surgeon for peer-to-peers, many times I've been told by the peer, I'm sorry, I can't do anything that's not in the policy. And while you're giving me peer-reviewed data that says that this is an appropriate procedure, our corporate policy is that it is not an appropriate procedure and you do not fit the criteria that we have previously written. And so it becomes a challenge in that my question is, if we push this concept of ensuring that we all have an equal peer, which I think is appropriate because there's a lot of times where we're talking about the nuances of our field. And obviously, I don't understand obstetrics and gynecology, and I wouldn't expect them to understand orthopedics. So there is an important layer there. It's just, I would want to at some point in time see that the legislation allows for a board certified orthopedic surgeon who's working for in utilization review to have the ability to overturn the decision, even if it's counter to the current policy of the insurance company. I think that would be the most important next step.
That actually sounds amazing. I mean, I wish that, I think that alone would make a big difference. And it's interesting to me to hear that the payers were so opposed to that. You know, what are the challenges with peer-to-peer? It's not just the fact that you get in a discussion with someone and you get to a no, but there's also, they're very time consuming. And there's even physicians now that are billing their patients for the peer-to-peer review to obtain remuneration for what is traditionally kind of a non-revenue generating activity. So there's a CPT code associated with this now. So my question is this a slippery slope for us to bill our patients for time that we spend arguing with their insurance companies? And is this a good thing for us to do or not? What are your thoughts, Brad?
That's a great question. I think when you say is it a good thing for us to do or not, I mean, obviously we're kind of preaching to the choir here a little bit. I think anything that can be done in the advocacy and policy arena is a good thing because we have been so grossly non-participatory as a profession and as for many of us as individuals in this realm. And it's just we just need numbers. We just need more folks to care about this. If all this work that we've done in advocacy and that Adam's done, if it does nothing more than inspire folks that are coming into the field now to care about it, to know about it. I mean, it was like I told you, it was years that I was in practice before I really even started to wake up to the importance of this. So yeah, I think we should do it. I think going to Adam's example of, when you're on that phone call with the peer, one, we got to always make sure it's a peer on the phone and go after that, which at least in my experience recently, I haven't had too many psychiatrists or OBGYNs on the other end of the line lately. I think we've maybe moved the needle on that. But then we got to move the policy, and we move the policy by moving the literature. So yeah, I would just say, kind of as a blanket answer, Peter, every single one of these things is good for us to do. And kind of the other plug I would make here is to say, just like there are folks that are really good at certain surgeries and not at others, there's folks that aren't going to be good at advocacy. That's not their skill set, and that's okay. And so for those of you that are listening to this podcast thinking, I don't get, going to talk to senators is not my thing. Doing research about policy stuff is not my thing. That's fine. But you need to support the people who do it. We give a ton of money to OREF and to our foundations for grants for research. What I would say is the equivalent to that is giving money to the AOS PAC. Many of you may not know, we don't actually have an ASES PAC. We kind of piggyback through the academy, because even though, within our world of orthopedics, we love to pick on the hand weenies or the spine nerds or the sports jocks or whatever derogatory term you want to use, we're still all under the same umbrella. And ultimately, the policymakers and the insurance companies don't split the hairs necessarily the way we do. And so piggybacking through the academy and the AOS PAC is how we get a lot of this done. I've hammered the research point, so I'll hammer this point too, of saying, yes, these things matter. Yes, they are good for us to be involved in. And if you're not going to be involved the way Adam is, spending the time to do the meetings and the travel and the meeting with executives and policymakers, and you're not going to necessarily do the research, you can at least pay your PAC dues. So complex answer for working in the PAC dues plug. But Adam, your thoughts on that?
Yes. So the push to get a CPT code is coming from a urologist who is very vocal about it. It is quite contentious as to whether or not it's the right thing to do. I have always been of the opinion that it's hard to encourage, if we don't like prior authorization and then we ask for a CPT code for it, it becomes difficult because we're at some point encouraging prior authorization as well, meaning we're willing to get paid for it and we're wanting to be paid for that work. And so you don't want to pay for the things that you don't want to have happen, essentially. And so as a matter of policy, it's a difficult one to support, although I understand the sentiment of I'm spending all this time, therefore I should get paid. I think the second thing we all really need to be conscious of, and it's something that's always in the back of my mind, is if we don't find a process that works, what's going to happen is prior authorization is going to go away. And you would think we should celebrate it went away. But the problem is, what is it being replaced with? And we're already seeing that. There was some data that just came out in this past week that showed prior authorization numbers were down. But it was up. Post-procedure denials. Those, to me, are the most deadly thing to independent practice. I can't think of something that could be worse. Post-procedure denials do a couple of things. Number one, you've already done all of the work. You're just not going to get paid. And now you're spending all of this time just to get paid and in a hope and a finger cross that it actually happens, right? Number two, it takes the patient out of the equation. In other words, when prior authorization is not functioning, a patient doesn't get the care they deserve. But when prior authorization is functioning, when prior authorization is eliminated, we go to post-procedure denials instead. Then the patient gets the care that they were looking for. And then when the doctor doesn't get paid, everybody's like, oh, well, who cares? The doctor just didn't get paid. At least I got what I needed. I got my knee replacement. I got my shoulder, my rotator cuff repair. I got whatever I needed done. That is a really, really scary place for us. And I can't imagine the amount of uncertainty that would be in private practice today if you weren't sure what percentage of your surgeries you were going to do were going to get paid and which ones were not. And if they keep running the dial on post-procedure denials like they have over the last decades on pre-procedure prior authorization, it could absolutely spell the end to private practice.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Because one thing I was going to say to your earlier question, Peter, about how do you get the one-offs approved, is you get the patient involved. And to Adam's point, that's what post-procedural denial takes out of the equation. We've had some success when we're trying to get a surgery approved, getting the patient to call their insurance company and or even the employer to call their insurance company. Because if it's a time frame thing of, hey, if we hurry up and get this cuff repaired or this, knee scoped or whatever, we'll get them back sooner. You can get the employer on your side, who ultimately is the customer of the insurance company, calling and saying, hey, we're paying these big premiums. We've got you guys on contract with us. We need you to do your job, to let the doctor do his job, to get this patient in and get him back to work. So pre-surgery, you have big advocates on your side, the patient and potentially their employer. But to Adam's point, once that's gone post-procedure, it's just you trying to get paid. And that generally doesn't work very well. So, yeah, I think, should we try to get paid for prior auth? Maybe. And to my point, one, that's got to go through the AMA and through the CPT creation process, and that's a very big lift and a long haul. But personally, I would just love that to see. I'd love to see that be a big issue. I'd love to see people talking about it rather than just kind of theoretically sending a bill here and there to do it. But I think the more these things get talked about on the national level, the more they get done. And then just kind of in closing, my personal thoughts on should you get a CPT for it. I would use the cautionary tale of PRP, wherein we spent a lot of time about 15 years ago coming up with a PRP code. And then the minute we created the code, every single insurance company denied it. So being able to capture it in a single code, to Adam's point, makes it much easier to deny and or replace it with something else that might be worse.
Great feedback from both of you. And I think we've all kind of summarized the fact that the current trajectory that we're on with increasing administrative oversight, decreased physician autonomy, has made the healthcare climate somewhat unsustainable. I do want to land on a little bit more of a positive note. What's the future of this process? And can you offer us some brief sources of optimism as we move forward? Adam, you certainly do a lot for us, and I really want to thank you in earnest for everything you're doing. Tell us your perspectives.
Yeah. So, listen, we have strong bipartisan support for reforming the process. And I think that's what everybody can go away with is there is a super majority of members of Congress who want to see this problem fixed. I would not want to be an insurance company spending time on Capitol Hill right now. They are kind of the least liked people, in particular, United Healthcare, given all that's going on. So I think we're in a good position. We have the Seniors Timely Access to Care Act, which I'm jokingly going to say we've been working on for a decade, but that bill is finally probably going to get done. It should have gotten done in December. Unfortunately, if you remember, if you followed politics, Elon Musk tweeted out a picture of the end of the year bill and how many pages it was that he printed out and said nobody should vote for this. It's not the best way of doing things, but it is the way that we've run the government for the last few decades. And in there was a payment fix for doctors. In there was the Seniors Timely Access to Care Act. I mean, there was some really good legislation in there that got stripped out because of that tweet. I think we're going to get it done this session. It's going to require a few things. Number one, to modernize the prior authorization process and make it electronic. Number two, it's going to require the insurance companies to provide data and tell data, and we'll be able to use that data in our communications on the Hill and elsewhere saying, come on, this is unreasonable. We're winning 98, 99% of the time, but we're being put through this so many times. It's burning out doctors. It just doesn't make any sense. Let's come up with a new process. And I think some of those changes are going to be very helpful. It's also going to put a specific timeline or a uniform timeline on urgent requests as well as regular requests, so they can't delay for weeks on end in getting us responses. So, I mean, it's a start. It's Medicare Advantage only. The Biden administration, interestingly, put these processes into a uh, actual regulatory framework that was put out there, and we now need to back that up with a bill, which is what Congress is getting done, and that will make it permanent. And then we'll work, once we get past Medicare Advantage, we'll work on getting all of the ERISA plans and the other plans. But it's going to take a concerted effort at the state level and the federal level, chipping away at each level, creating model legislation like what we did with the Gold Card Act. We'd love to sit down and have our experts on the Gold Card Act in Texas go around the country and show that model legislation and give it to other states and say, hey, this is what's working, this is what's not working. How do we make this better? That's how things get done. And I think we're energized. I see the patients are interested in doing this. Patient support groups are interested in doing this. The government's interested in doing this at every level. We have the upper hand. It's just time to strike. It's time to put ideas out there, and it's time to make things fixed.
I agree. And Adam, I'd follow you anywhere, brother. It's so inspiring to hear your knowledge of this and your excitement about it. And Brian, to kind of give you my positive perspective, it's kind of ironic that sometimes it takes negative energy or negative times to spark positive change. You think back to the 80s where surgeons were basically fat and happy doing 3 total knees a week and making more money than folks doing 20 a week now, in real dollars, non-inflation adjusted. And there wasn't as much negativity. There wasn't as much need to care about policy because there was not as much negativity. But I think what's been interesting is to see some of these negative things, these bad policies, to see our response to it. When we did that special issue of the journal, it was awesome to see how many young authors were contributing papers. I think the incoming generation of surgeons that's coming into their own as attendings, or that's even coming up as fellows right now, they get it. They get that policy matters. They get that they can have an influence on it. And so that's what I've tried to do throughout this podcast, is just encourage those of you that are listening. You can make a difference. And it's been fun to see it because as Adam's talked about it from the high level, the winds are kind of blowing our way a little bit. Yeah, there's a lot of negativity, but when you start to notice it and do something about it, you can change it back in the other direction. So I think whether it's research or involvement or whatever, it's been really fun to see how folks are responding to this, not just with complaining about it around the water cooler, but taking action and doing it. And I'll kind of close with the plug of those of you in the ASES should be very proud because our organization has won the AAOS PAC Hall of Fame, which is given basically to the subspecialty society that does the best job of PAC donation and PAC activity participation. So essentially those that care the most about advocacy and about making a difference. And we've won that award now for 3 years in a row, and hopefully we'll win it a 4th time this fall at the NOLC. So yeah, there is a lot to be excited about. Unfortunately, it's driven by our response to some of these negative things, but there is a lot to be excited about in this area.
You all have shared incredible perspectives, and I just, on behalf of Peter and I, and I'm sure the broader ASES, we just really want to thank you both for your time and your very intelligent perspectives, but also the keys to the future. And there's a lot to unpack here. This is a contentious and ever evolving topic. So we definitely, hopefully, can come back to this at some point in time and have a part 2. But we just really want to thank you for being on tonight.
Thanks, Brian. It's been an honor, and I really want to give a shout out to Adam, who's not a shoulder surgeon, but he came to our annual meeting this past year and gave an amazing talk at the meeting down in Texas. Granted, it wasn't his hometown, so he didn't have to fly anywhere, but he still gave up a night to be with us. And so thanks for doing it again, buddy. We really appreciate all you're doing, not just for shoulder surgeons, but for all of us under the orthopedic umbrella.
Thank you. It's a pleasure and honor to help push this forward. And as we will all say, it's always about our patients first, and ensuring that our patients get the care that they need and they deserve, based on the best training that we've been given, based on training in the best healthcare system in the world. And we need to ensure that our patients get that care, and whatever it takes to get there is what we're going to do.
Well, Brad, Adam, both of you guys were phenomenal. And I really appreciate your guys' time and also the efforts you've taken on behalf of our physicians and surgeons here. So for all of our shoulder and elbow listeners out there, don't forget to subscribe. And for Brian Waterman, I'm Peter Chalmers, and we will see you next time.